Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, we are visiting with Jon Rich with AgriPro. Jon Rich is a graduate of Kansas State University. He has worked for AgriPro wheat breeding for almost 25 years. He has experienced breeding wheat in the Great Plains, including hybrid wheat breeding. Jon is based in the AgriPro wheat breeding site in Junction City, Kansas. He has two beautiful daughters, Ella and Reese, with his wife, Carrie, residing now in Manhattan, Kansas. Jon, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Aaron. Really looking forward to this discussion today and talking a little bit about my passion, and that's wheat.
Well, it certainly is. You've been doing this for a long time. How did you get in this career path? I know you have some mentors and a little bit of family background with it.
Yeah, it really all started with my grandparents owned a family farm out in Comanche County, Kansas, in between Protection and Coldwater. And so if you know anything about farming in that area, it is a very tough life out there. And so seeing more of ranching, but there was always wheat grown on the acres because of how hard it is to grow other crops. And so I really got my passion for agriculture there, but my dad was a wheat breeder. And so I grew up watching him work in the greenhouses, making crosses in my early days. As young as 7 or 8, I remember going into the greenhouses and making crosses with Trio Research, which is now Lima Grain, cereal seeds there in Wichita, Kansas. I grew up in Valley Center High School. And then, I slowly started working there, started working there full time when I was 14 with my dad, doing all the remedial tasks, the fun stuff of a plant breeding program. And then, so my dad was probably my biggest mentor, but I can't forget, I think about this a lot. My mom was a huge mentor in my life just because she was one that gave me my tenacity to be decent at this role, because in plant breeding, you fail a lot, and you got to keep going. Mother Nature, as most farmers are realizing here the last couple of years with the drought we've had, you have to keep going, and so my mom gave me a lot of tenacity. But my dad really taught me a lot of the basics of going to work and just doing the right thing. And then I was lucky enough to come up to Kansas. I went out to Fort Hays and learned with Joe Martin for 2 years.
Sure.
And that was a really unique experience working for Joe. He had a totally different perspective on things, and so I really respected that. Then I came up to K-State. One of my best friends played football here, and he asked me to come to Kansas State. So I came up here, and lucky enough, was able to hook up with Dr. Rollie Sears, who's been on this podcast previously. And he had a role going to start AgriPro, kind of the restart of AgriPro wheat. AgriPro's been around since mid-'70s, and this is back in the summer of '99, fall of '99. And I just called Rollie up and said, "Hey, you got a role?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, but he looked at my resume. I'll never forget this day. He looked at my resume and he goes, you have 14 years. You have 14 years of experience and you're 21 years old. He thought I was lying on my resume, and I don't remember having 14 years on there. So I went out and started with him. He was a great mentor. And then probably and Rollie taught me a lot about wheat, and he was I think one of the funniest stories about Rollie is when I thought I was a young whippersnapper, knew everything about plant breeding, we're out looking at plants. And Rollie had this thing with green leaf duration. And, hey, if this plant stays green longer, it's going to be a healthier plant. You're going to have more yield. And I remember out with him, and I thought, I know everything about plant path because I had infected a tomato plant and stuff in plant pathology class. And I remember walking with him. I go, "What disease is this, Rollie?" And the whole plant's dead. And he looks at me, and he goes, "It doesn't matter. It's dead." And so I thought that was a great way, and it made me first
keep it simple.
Yeah, just keep it simple. And plant breeding in general is a very simple. There's a lot of skill sets that you need from statistics and plant pathology, plant physiology, agronomy, even project management, all these things, statistics. But in the end, it's a very simple thing. And I think that starting with the simple, and then probably one of my other biggest mentors I probably learned the most from in my life was a guy named Harold Erickson. Was our basically key guy at AgriPro for many years, running the trials and stuff. and he worked at K-State for many years up in the production team. And he taught me, and I always say this, like Harold was the most uneducated guy that I ever knew. He always, didn't have a college degree, but he taught me more about just life and working, spending all those hours traveling around the side, time. So he taught me a little different perspective, and he kept it simple too, and how you had to grind through some of these situations. So I've had a lot of mentors, and I would say that, to wrap this, part up is it's been all the people that I'm around too. I mean, I've been around a lot of great breeders, from Alan Fritz to all the public breeders. I've learned something from all them. David Worrell was in the past, Rob Bruns in the old AgriPro days, Joe Smith in AgriPro days, and I took a little bit from all of them. They all went about plant breeding a lot differently, have a lot different ways of doing it. And I've tried to take a little bits and pieces of how they did it, but in the end, you get to the same question, as that is, did you sell a bag of seed today? And do you have good products for the farmers? And I think we've proven that at AgriPro, the last almost 50 years.
I think it's great that you're a legacy wheat breeder. I imagine if we went around the world and asked, I think we could probably count those on one hand. Think back to when you were a kid and working with your dad and observing it. What was it probably that most fascinated you about what he did that stuck out in your mind and said, hey, someday I want to do this?
That's a great question. Probably just there's a lot of talk about sustainability this day and age, right? And what I always saw out there was plants that survived and plants that didn't. And I always thought that was fascinating to see how they were adapted, how the plants reacted to different situations, to drought, to heat, to high yield potential. And you'd walk out there and you just have things flat on the ground and others were standing straight up. It was just the fascination of, you're looking at a bunch of different genetic combinations and they react so differently in all different settings. And that always has kind of captured me. And I think that's why agriculture in general has always captured me, is that it's such a fun discipline to do. And I kind of liked it is because probably the biggest thing, though, to really answer your question, to get back to it, is there wasn't any one thing you focus on a given day. And I've always been a person that I like doing a lot of different things. I like learning about a lot of different things. And that's what plant breeding really is. It's understanding everything from farming practices. We might talk about this here in a little bit, but when you think about what we've seen with crop rotations and no-till, the transformation of that, like when I started in this, you didn't even think about that. We were burning stubble still, right? And so you just start to see the transformation of farming and agriculture. And then as a plant breeder, you have to adapt to that. We have to adapt to, how do we provide products that work well planted late after soybeans, right? So I think that's what always intrigued me. That was ever changing. There was never a year that was the same. Probably why I love to play golf is the same thing. I play the same golf course, and it's a different round every time, and that's plant breeding. Every year is different. We were talking about that a little bit before we started today, that every year throws a little different curveball at you.
Great answer. So we'll get more into the science about wheat breeding, but before we move forward, we probably should have a little bit of refresher on AgriPro. You mentioned it was formed in the 70s. Give us a little quick elevator pitch here about AgriPro's beginning and how it evolved over the past several decades.
Yeah, I mean, AgriPro was formed back in about 1976. And so we are the largest, currently the largest private wheat breeding program in the U.S. And so over that time, they went through several different iterations, and I won't go through each organization that bought AgriPro and the transitions. But over that time, they went through some transition, different leadership styles and different things. But I think the biggest transformation was really that time frame there in, the late 90s, 1999, when Dr. Rollie Sears, David Worrell, coming out of Texas A&M, who developed TAM 111, which many people would recognize on this podcast. And then also Rob Bruns out in Colorado as well. And so they started this new era with, legendary wheat breeders like Joe Smith, who up in the northern plains, spring wheat still has the top varieties grown in the state. John Moffitt, who was a graduate of Kansas State, was up in the Pacific Northwest, did work in the Central Plains a little bit too. So we had this powerhouse of wheat breeders. And so over that time, we were able to develop these really high market shares. We have held, at least number one market share in pretty much every state over that time frame. Now, some people could argue with me. I'm not going to go back there. I mean, there'd probably be, some states where we haven't, but it was really close. We've always had a good amount of genetics everywhere. And then I think, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, the biggest transformation's probably been here in the last 10 years where we're trying to go out on this endeavor of hybrid wheat.
We'll certainly get in depth on that. There's a lot of competition for acres in Kansas, which is a good thing for farmers. This is where all the wheat acres are. And you've got the benefit of having perspective, kind of worked for the public breeding program and now a private breeding program. Share with us your perspective on the difference, the similarities between the two, between an AgriPro and a land-grant university, how you compete and how you collaborate.
Probably one of the things that the biggest differences is probably the speed aspect. At a company, we're pretty agile, so we can move pretty fast. Probably a little bit different than the public university in that aspect. There's positives and negatives to that, right? And so that would probably be one thing. When you talk about collaboration, this is something that hits home to me as a wheat person. One of the things that was always awesome about the wheat breeding community is we've always kind of felt like we're kind of looked down upon a little bit, maybe, compared to the other crops. I mean, funding, research, all those things, right? And we always shared ideas. And I think that's been one of the biggest untold stories in the wheat industry, is that the collaboration between public and private has really enhanced the grower's experience over these times. And I've seen that transformation. I mean, you just look at that now and you look at 20 years ago, right? You had Jagger and then you had maybe 2137 as an option for Kansas farmers. I go out and go to field days now in Oklahoma, Kansas, all these, and I see the genetics and from all the companies, public, private, and it makes me really proud, not just to be part of AgriPro, but it makes me pretty proud of the wheat community that all of this collaboration that we've done over the years to improve not only disease tolerances, but just the ability. I mean, we keep breaking yield records and we have an unstable climate. We know that. I mean, things change all the time. And I think that's been one of the coolest things. I mean, I can't point to any one collaboration that, but I think it's a combination of that. It's a sharing of germplasm, strategic sharing of germplasm, not just, we're going to throw this out there. And, I've had a great relationship with Alan here at Kansas State where we are sharing, hey, I have this deficiency. He has this. What do you have? We look at that and we understand that this isn't about, and we're competitive. We want to beat each other. Alan wants to beat me every day and I want to beat him. Right. But the reality is we understand that for the betterment of the wheat industry, we're going to be better off. And you see that right now with the genetics. I think I looked at the latest varietal thing, and I remember when I first started in this, like Jagger was 60% of the acres, and I think the top yielding one this year was Monument, which is ours, was like at 7%.
Yeah.
And there's 15 different ones. So that's been really cool how much and that's gone down a lot in the last 5 to 10 years of collaboration, just due to the ability of freedom to operate, both on our side. That's a corporate thing too, but also the universities, too. Everybody's trying to protect themselves from certain things, but there's still ways that we're still working together tremendously to bring forward to the farmers, producers.
I think that proliferance of varieties in the 20 plus years I've been in the industry has made farmers better too, right? They're excited to get that variety catalog in the mail. It's almost like getting a football recruiting guide or something to see the newest and latest thing out there. Hasn't that really, stepped up wheat's game overall from not just the genetic standpoint, but from agronomic too?
Yeah, because it gives the farmers ability to put different genetics on their farm, right? Like, when you were just a jagger, like for example, we just had a pretty significant freeze go through Kansas, right? And if you plant all the same genetics on your farm, you have a lot more risk. When you could plant at least three different genetics on your farm and place it on the acres that I tell our, Josh Coltrane's really good product placement scientist for us. And we talk a lot about this, that our goal is to develop these lines and give the farmers information. Where would these products work the best? And now the farmers have these, because they know their ground better than we do, right? They know where their bad fields are. They know where their good fields. They know where they have low pH problems. They know where they have, something else. And so they're able to look at these genetics and place it on the grounds, which I think that has had huge inputs into why we're seeing these yield gains, because they have the genetics. These guys are able to place their things on there, but also there's other things around fungicide use and agronomy has gotten a lot better in the last 10 to 15 years too. And I think with that being said, I think part of that reason is that corn and soy have helped with that a little bit, right? Corn, you have to manage a lot different than you have to manage a wheat crop. So I think that when we sometimes as a wheat breeder, we badmouth, as I say, corn's a very wimpy crop. And wheat's the tougher crop for sure. But the reality is corn has helped us be better stewards and better producers of wheat over time. As much as I give, much crap as I give corn, it has helped us.
Yeah, I agree with you. Let's get back to the whole crop rotation picture and get your perspective on that. How Make your case for keeping wheat in a rotation. We've seen in Western Kansas, wheat being dropped out of the rotation, which you and I are obviously biased, but that doesn't seem good to me. So make the case.
Yeah, I hate to see acres becoming gluten intolerant. The soil is not gluten intolerant. Sorry, I just had to make a joke there. No, I think wheat just offers so much. I mean, when you think about little things like the cover crop craze, right? And there's a lot of cover crop, and there's a lot of need for that, right? In certain areas, I think wheat gives us great ground cover, great residue, keeps the soil healthy. When you have it in rotation with other crops, your ability to change out herbicides, which changes weed resistance issues. There's just a lot of the soil health type calculations that are really beneficial, and it's just, I think that's what's really cool. You also look at, wheat acres for grazing of cattle. So it's not just, hey, this is a cash crop for me. So those are the kind of the agronomic things. But economically, I really have always been fascinated with wheat because from a farmer perspective, when you're growing these, fall crops, to have a wheat crop that can give you some cash flow early in the year where you're not waiting, towards there. I think there's some big benefits just from a financial standpoint of having wheat in there, to have a little cash flow to help you with some of your other financial things that you're trying to do with your other crops. And so I think really, I think there's just so many benefits to having wheat in your rotation. And for farmers, it's a relatively easy crop to plant. I know we talk about, well, I could plant my wheat and forget it. I hear this, hashtag poverty grass and different things, but it's not a poverty grass. It's something that, and I think about this when I see those things, I think about what wheat did for my grandparents in Comanche County, Kansas, right? They didn't raise a family, they raised a family because they had cattle. They had the grains. They had all these things working simultaneously together. And I think that's what is so key to farmers going forward is those items.
Winter wheat's such a unique animal. I mean, we could get into the cover crop thing more. Cover crops used to be about soil erosion, right?
Yep.
And now it's shifting more to soil health and living root, which even though winter wheat doesn't have a living root all year, it sure has some benefits when it doesn't have a living root. But you also get into the water issue. Wheat is a low water use crop, and I know you don't Jon Rich doesn't have a crystal ball, but 10 years in the future with these water issues, I mean, what do you think is going to happen with wheat? Are corn hybrids going to keep getting better and better, or is wheat going to be kind of gain a greater role in Western Kansas?
I would say yes to all those things. All of the companies aren't putting massive amount of resources into corn for them to yield less, right? So they're going to keep growing, but that's why I think we're working on hybrid wheat right now. We're putting resources in that to have maybe a technological breakthrough on taking wheat to the next level. And so I think those are some of the, key attributes there. But, when you talk about the water issue, that's probably one of my passions right now is really reading up on water issues, because I've had the pleasure of traveling to many different places like Yuma, Arizona for off-season nurseries where they grow 70% of our, winter lettuce production. And you see the Colorado River drying up, and you see all these discussions about how is this going to stay forward. Now, that's not necessarily about wheat in general, but it is. We're going to have these major crop growing areas that in the next probably 25, 30, 40 years, there's going to be a reckoning. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the same way when you look at the panhandle of Texas with the Ogallala Aquifer. There's a lot of corn out there, but what else is there out there? There's a lot of dairies. And so that's a huge component that we have to maintain that for our national interest. And how do we do that? And I think that's another good reason when you go back to rotation of why wheat is a good in a rotation, because it's something that, on all, especially all the pivots, when you get out in southwest Kansas, panhandle of Texas, that they're able to utilize their water allotments a lot better and still having a cash crop or some silage. It's amazing to me when you travel how much wheat is chopped anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, that's been a big, it's something I just thought about during our discussion here, but that's something that's really changed. Like that was not talked about a lot. Mm-hmm. And you go in the panhandle of Texas, they chop a lot of wheat, along with triticale as well. But it's amazing to me how that's being used as a rotation as well, because they can chop wheat, get the corn in, and do another silage harvest for the feedlots and the dairies in that area.
Well, let's get into hybrid wheat since we're talking about drought and water. This is something that AgriPro is truly invested in, and how do things look in that arena?
It's really well. I think one of the key things is so far we've had a really patient leadership group that's allowed us to keep working on hybrid wheat. One of the big things in the past, if anybody knows about hybrid wheat's been tried. I mean, Monsanto back in the day with Hybrid Tech did it. Prior to that, I think it was Roman Haas did that as well, and they failed, right? I mean, because there's not hybrid wheat, so if it would have been successful. But failure isn't maybe the right word. They were successful in a lot of areas, but it was just the ability to scale.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
Both from a production standpoint, but also from an R&D pipeline standpoint. I mean, I think one of the big things that we've learned in the last, 10, 12 years doing this is that to have a consistent pipeline like you do in a varietal program where you're making crosses, bringing things through, that's where the biggest. And our leadership so far has stayed very consistent and patient with us. Will that last forever? No. So we have a really stable pipeline of new products that we're looking at every year. I think where we've been successful is not only understanding how hybrid wheat works, because a little bit of the science behind it, and I won't go real technical, but you have to make a self-pollinated crop, wheat, right, which contains all the sexual structure in the same plant, an outcrossing plant like corn, right, which has a tassel and an ear, right, that are totally separated from each other. So people ask, well, how do you separate that? Well, how we do that is you have a female, which is male-sterile, and you have a male, which has the pollen for you. But that's just part of the story, because to make sure that you maintain that female, which is sterile every year, you can't just go plant that A line and not have any pollen. You have to have what they call a maintainer line beside it, which is the same thing, but is fertile. So you got to be crossing that A-line seed. Then the next year, it is always cytoplasmic sterile. And so then you have the sterile plant, and the new R-line that comes over restores the fertility back into that. So that's where the complications of hybrid wheat come in, and the scalability that I talked about in the pipeline, because not only do we have to do this in a farmer's field, we have to do this behind the scenes in an R&D program at very small scale. This isn't like corn where you can have 10 seeds and produce 10 pounds, right? We're planting, tens of thousands of seeds in a small area to get back pounds, right? So there's a multiplication rate factor, and that's always been probably the biggest reason why the scalability factor of wheat is. But with that being said, we have launched hybrid wheat on a very small scale in Northern Plains spring wheat. And I think we've learned a lot. We failed a lot during this time too, and we've learned kind of some of the rights and wrongs in this. But I think one of the key things that we've really learned is the production is scalable that we're using, which is huge. We're seeing it, we keep seeing this reduction in cost of goods, which is going to be a huge thing, right? But we got to keep moving the yield levels up, right? And the thing with hybrid wheat is you have heterosis, which is above and beyond our yields. But how do we maximize that going forward? And is the farmer going to pay extra for that? So we got to show that 2-to-1, 3-to-1 return on seed for that hybrid thing. So I think overall, we're making the right progress. Like I said, we've launched it. We've had some success. We've had some failures too. I try to be very open and honest about this. This isn't an easy undertaking. And so we're going to see how it goes. I think it's not any different than when you saw, the Roundup Ready craze and stuff. I don't think it's going to be anything on that scale where you scale up. And I mean, Roundup Ready soybeans were just like that. It was, basically the farmer's like, oh, that works, I'm using it. Will hybrid wheat be like that? I think if we find the right product, there could possibly be that way. But I think it's still, we're still working through those things. But the things that I see on a daily basis in our programs, leading those is there's a lot of potential there. And now can we get that consistent? It's not any different than what we did in varietal. I mean, when you think about, we started this endeavor about 12 years ago, that's a very short time frame.
For wheat, absolutely.
It's not any different. If you just start a varietal wheat program tomorrow, you're not going to be delivering the best genetics to the producers, right? So I think we're just starting to see some of our fruits of our labor right now with some of these products that are coming. And I think that's what's exciting behind the scenes.
You want to share any timelines with us on hybrid wheat?
Yeah, so like I said, we've launched hybrid wheat and spring wheat. So we're going to have a significant, would be the spring of 25. God, I'm getting old. Start thinking about 2025. Spring of 25, we'll have a fairly large spring wheat, and then winter wheat will be about a year to two behind that. And that's just due to the ability of spring wheat. You can go a lot faster, right? You don't have the vernalization requirement. So we can go to market with the spring wheat and varietal on the varietal side in about 8 years, because how fast. Where winter wheat's about 10. So we're kind of in that 1 to 2 range. And I think what I would give a lot of credit to both, Greg McCormick and Paul Morano, both on our commercial teams. I give them a lot of credit too, is they understand that you have to do this in segments. The scalability of this, the learnings of this from a commercial component are very important. And so let's learn, let's win in spring wheat, then we'll bring it to winter wheat. And what I think is going to be cool about that for the winter wheat growers is hopefully we have a lot of the kinks worked out, right? So the spring wheat growers would tell you right now, there's some kinks to this, but I think where you come into the winter wheat, we hopefully have some of these, and I think that's how we're going to be able to scale this at a greater scale than we did before, because we are having that patience to meet those market demands.
We'll take a little sidebar here and get back to science, but it goes back to my mantra, the winter wheat ain't easy. Do you ever roll out of bed in the morning and wish you were a spring wheat breeder instead of a winter wheat breeder?
That's kind of funny that you say that. I've had a lot of great colleagues working winter, spring wheat, but it's They are different crops. It's kind of crazy. They're wheat, but they're different crops. It's how they react, their ability to have short seasons. It's funny, I mean, I'll kind of segue back into science. When you talk about like modeling, like how intricate, we haven't talked about this yet, but when you talk about how much change, not only from a crop rotation and farmers and the technology in the fields and GPS and all these things that have transformed how people farm, we've seen that explosion in breeding, right? And the one thing that always I laugh at, because I read papers and stuff about crop modeling and predictions and stuff with genetics, right? And one of the things is that you could predict spring wheats pretty good because of their growing season. You got April through July, right? That's easier to predict the climate. When you get to winter wheat, I've always laughed that we have these poor graduate students having to try to model and predict winter wheat.
Yeah.
That doesn't go very well, because that wheat plant goes through a dry fall, a wet fall, barley yellow dwarf infected fall, a winter season where you have snow on it for 3 weeks, to no snow all winter, to very warm, almost constantly growing. There's no way. It's very, very hard to model those things out. So that's where spring wheat is a little bit simpler, that you can do some of these environmental models to help you have better predictions and stuff, on that side. But, winter wheat yields are fun. Winter wheat's different because it can yield so high. I had the pleasure to be out in the Pacific Northwest last week looking at, I was looking at 170, 180 bushel wheat.
Wow.
So
that's got to be neat.
Oh, it's a totally, you got to readjust your eye.
Yeah.
But it just shows you the potential of wheat.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just, I got this wheat and I get 45 bushels every year. The potential is there. Even in the Central Plains varieties, you get those in the right situations right now, they yield. And that's what's exciting about hybrid wheat too, is that we know the yield potential is there. And now it is just zoning it in and getting it consistent, because let's just be honest, in the winter wheat area, and pretty much all wheat breeding's this way, you have to have consistency. You can have the top end yields, you can have these other attributes, but one hit wonders usually don't stay around very long.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key that we're trying to really zone in on hybrid wheat too.
Well, we learned 150 years ago when the Mennonites brought turkey red wheat to Kansas that winter wheat is the right fit for Kansas instead of spring wheat.
Yep.
But talking about yield potential, we had a few good years, and the last 3 years were not great years in Kansas to this extended drought, but we were getting 110, 120 bushel dryland winter wheat in parts of western Kansas. So we know that potential, and it's the same with all breeding programs. You've got to balance yield and quality, right? And then there's always the question, well, why don't we have a feed class wheat? So how do you balance that? What's your goal on all that?
Yeah, our goal, for breeding, we know we have an end user that has a use for this product, right? So we can't just have something that is high yielding but acts like a soft wheat, right, and contaminates our flow. Justin Gilpin and I have had a lot of discussions about this around white wheat, right? Hard white wheat. And I've always, I think Aaron, you're kind of in the same thing too, is I'm really to the thing. I think it's all one class, right? White and red wheat's one class. Basically. It shouldn't be segregated.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important distinction. I think that would be a huge change to the Kansas, farmers in Kansas, right? Where we have this. But we still balance that a lot. I mean, I think back about what AgriPro wheat did. We were the ones that actually, along with the end use industry, started the Platte program back in the day. I mean, Platte was an AgriPro variety, and it's still called the Platte program to this day. Now, Colorado State has some great varieties that are gone into that with special components into that. But we've always had a real focus on quality and yield. But that's what makes it hard in a breeding situation too, right? Is how do we balance that quality with yield? Because the other reality is the farmers are getting paid for yield. And so we know as a business, we got to make money. And so, how do we balance that, making sure we're good stewards of the industry, but also serving to the farmer that needs to make money so more corn isn't growing on his ground is a very significant thing. And I think until we get to a point where the industry is aligned in what type of quality standards we need and how can farmers profit off of that too, as if that makes sense, right? Because even in spring wheat, well, I've learned a lot about spring wheat, in my position here the last, 6 or 7 years, is that farmers get paid a premium some years, depending on the year, for protein, right? But that doesn't mean that the variety has better quality profiles than, say, a Monument with lower in winter wheat, right? So it's that kind of that question, but how do we align that across a large 23 million acres of wheat in the plains, 8-9 million acres in Kansas? How do we leverage those markets and make it to where there's easy delivery points for the farmers? Because I think that's one thing. Farmers want ease too. So I think there's a lot of questions. I mean, from a breeding standpoint, we still focus on these things, but there's probably some bigger questions about that. But that also comes into, things. I know sustainability gets a bad word, and for a lot of different reasons, and it makes people cringe a little bit. But that's what plant breeding is sustainability, right? We are developing products, and in the same way with quality too, right? We're continually raising yields, but the end use of most of our varieties out there's always a couple that sneak through that we all, in the industry kind of shake our heads and goes, what is that thing doing in there, right? But you still have to focus on that, right? And we understand that, and we're not trying to but I think it's a very hard question to answer, from an industry standpoint. How do we get everybody aligned? And I think we've tried to do that, and it hadn't worked out all the time. But I think that could be the biggest change, in the next 10 years of what happens. I think it's going to be more around a food health situation. I know Brett Carver at Oklahoma State is doing a lot of that right now down there. And I think that, I think there are going to be some of those questions in the next 10 years of how do we add value to wheat? I think that's probably, to sum up that long-winded answer there, is where we have to get to.
Yeah, adding value. I think you and I would agree that we barely scraped the surface of understanding wheat, right? The crop's been around for 10,000 years. I think we're in the golden age of wheat research. So we probably should talk about GMO wheat and gene editing before we move on from the science part. I mean, you make DHs at AgriPro just like we do here at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. You're on hybrid wheat, but gene editing is in the current pool of tools that's being used. And we've talked about it on this podcast before, but there is now GMO wheat in the world, specifically in Argentina. And before you and I retire, we may have GMO wheat here in the U.S. So of all those tools, which would you rather have access to? What do you think is the best fit for AgriPro? Loaded question.
Everything.
Yeah.
This one's always a tough, slippery slope question, right? There's a lot of misinformation around how gene editing works, but I've also had the pleasure of working with a couple GMO things in the past. We're not doing any gene editing or GMO at AgriPro Wheat currently, but in the past we looked at some FHB tolerance lines, and they were totally immune. And you talk about a food safety thing. I mean, that is huge, right? I know a lot of people always kind of connotate GMO with more herbicides or more insecticides or whatever it is. But I think that's where we got to change that actually there's some real benefits to some of these traits that we could add in. I mean, you start talking about traits that could be added in for health reasons, right? High fiber type stuff. I think that's where it could be a huge thing. You talk about FHB tolerance and avoiding vomitoxins in our grain supplies, and that eliminates a spray, right? I mean, so you start talking about these things, and I think that's where we got to be more positive on that. I mean, it really goes back to hybrid wheat as well, as there's other hybridization techniques that you could use with gene editing, right? To make it easier to produce the seed and those type of things. So I think there's a lot of things. I think you kind of see the winds of change to me on this. People are getting used to in these other crops, back to making fun of corn. They have helped us in this area, right? I think the education's a little bit better. Europe's starting to come around. Some of these other countries that is, I know, where you work here, Kansas wheat is real important. We got to be able to export, right? We can't close up markets. So I think there's some of those political things that are starting to turn a little bit. And I think that could be the next thing that happens in the next 10 years. But I think the biggest important thing is just to remember that we want to look at everything, and it's not just about what technology you use, but we want to be on the forefront of that too, right? We want to develop that, as we go forward.
Well, in the time we have left, Jon, let's move away from science here a little bit. You said you've indicated to me you have a passion for helping the next generation navigate the corporate world. What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's been that's a great question, and something I've been really passionate about is scientific leadership. I think that one of the things I see when I was going to school, I learned about plant physiology, I learned about plant pathology, I learned about how do you run a breeding program. But the one thing they never teach you about, and that you don't find out about, is how do you work with people?
Yeah.
Right. And, I got asked this question the other day. I did a plant path seminar at Kansas State, and one of the professors asked me, well, what skill sets do you need in your people that are coming out? And honestly, I can't even explain. I work with some of the most, every person that I work with right now is way more intelligent than I am, way smarter, technically better than I am, because I know all the new technical skills. I learn from them more every day than they would ever learn from me. So I kind of preface the question as it isn't about what your technical skill sets are. All these kids come out of the universities. The universities do a great job of developing our young generation technically. But a lot of times as scientists, we aren't always great people leaders. And I've noticed that going through my years. I've worked with some of the most brilliant scientists ever, and they shouldn't probably be around people. And I say that as somebody I've had to learn to adapt. We don't know everything as scientists. We think we do, but we don't. And I think that's the key thing, is developing. And so my answer, back to my point, is the answer I gave to them is are you easy to work with? Can you deal with change? Because in the corporate world, change is happening all the time. I mean, it's just constantly. You get new leadership, new things come in. Can you be professionally mature to deal with the change and move forward? And then the thing I kind of mentioned that earlier about my mom, but I think this is key, is tenacity. You have to have tenacity. You can get down. You can think that the change isn't right, but you have to grind through it. You have to push through that barrier. But I think the key one is just being easy to work with, honestly. And that doesn't mean that you have to give in to every situation or everything, right? It just means that, hey, you get to a point, you give them all the information, we figure out how to work together, and we move on. And I think that's key, and it's something that I really have a passion for, kind of in my back half of my career here. It's kind of crazy to say that I'm on the back half of my career now. It shows in my beard, but it's something I just, and you can see the passion I have for this today. I think that this job has gave me more than I could ever give it back. This industry, the people, and that's kind of what I want to give back to this next generation of young plant breeders, to see the opportunity they have to raise their families, see my daughters and my wife, been able to give them great life. And I think that's my key thing, is just, really getting them to understand that this job is fairly simple in the end. And if you keep it simple, you're going to be successful.
Good for you. Yeah, the science isn't easy, but the job could be simple.
Yes.
Should be simple.
Yeah.
Any final words, Jon? I know farmers out there right now aren't in the wheat farmers. It's been a struggle the last few years. Tell them there's brighter days ahead, I suppose.
Back, I'll just say it again. Farmers farmers have tenacity, right? They're going to weather the storm. We can't control Mother Nature, right? We can control the genetics we grow on our farm. We can control how you agronomically treat your crop. You can control how you budget for certain situations. That would be my message. Is just control what you can control. None of us can go, hey, don't have freeze damage in Partridge, Kansas, and, run my wheat crop. I can't make it rain, there, but do everything you can for when that opportunity arises, you get the 110, 120 bushel wheat that you had for the farmers. And I think the most positive thing is for the producers is, God, the genetics are good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everywhere. I know there's a lot of, we give the corporations a lot of crap, and rightfully so, probably sometimes, right? I'm not going to be disingenuous on that. But the amount of investment that these groups have done to bring these genetics, both privately and publicly, working together is one of the most tremendous things I've ever seen, right? We talk about the Green Revolution with Norman Borlaug and what he did, but I really believe we're kind of in our own Green Revolution. I mean, just to see how resilient these crops are and the crop yields that we're getting with all the crops, and how we use rotations, how we use no-till, all these sciences coming together is really, really pretty cool.
Even in this drought, I've heard more often than once, boy, the wheat looks better than it really should.
Yes. Yeah.
And that is a credit to guys like you. Well, John, we didn't cover everything, but I'm sure we'll have you back on another episode, but thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I appreciate everything you guys do at Kansas Wheat.
My thanks to Jon Rich for joining us on the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. Remember, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover or a question for one of our guests, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.